Metacast Crypto Corner, brought to you by Naavik. I'm your host, Niko Vuori. Today, we're going to be talking about the intersection of blockchain technology and game development. Specifically, we're talking about the Solana blockchain. As Web3 developers, we obviously have options out there for where we want to build, which chains we want to integrate with. And today, we get a chance to talk to one of the biggest ones out there. So what does Solana have going for it? For starters, it has scale, over 11 million active accounts on Solana. Secondly, cost. The current cost per transaction on Solana is, I think, 0.00025 cents per transaction or something along those lines. So very, very low. And then finally, speed. Block times are, I think, now below 400 milliseconds. And I think improving all the time. But that's all great. But ultimately, the real question is why build on Solana when there are other options out there? What is Solana doing for Web3 gaming in particular? How is it supporting the developer ecosystem? And so to answer those questions, we have Kuleen Nimkar, who is the Director of Games at the Solana Foundation. And he's going to be on the pod today to answer our burning questions. Kuleen, it is great to have you here. Welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me. Super excited to have this conversation. I always enjoy our chats. So and now the rest of the world gets to listen in.
Likewise. All right, so cool. We got that out of the way. Let's dive right into today's episode with some questions here. So I want to actually start at the very, very beginning, which is kind of the origin story for Solana. Like, what is the reason for Solana existing? And so, that's really the question, like, why Solana versus Ethereum or Polygon or BSC or any of the other options out there? So I actually want to ask about proof of stake versus proof of work. I think many of our listeners are familiar with those terms, but I really want to understand what was it about, Anatoly's insight in 2017 with his white paper, and then, of course, actually going live as recently as March 2020. I didn't realize. I thought Solana had actually been around for a little longer, but realized how recent, you going live with the ledger actually is. So I just want to get a little bit of a kind of a behind the scenes inside story on what was it about proof of stake that was like Anatoly's insight and then led to the actual ledger going live in 2020.
Totally. So it's actually, I think, quite an instructive story. And it's worth calling out, actually, that there's more here than proof of stake, but I can get into it. I think the original problem that Anatoly was trying to solve was, first and foremost, one of scale. So when he looked at Ethereum, right, so his background is very much in building networking systems at places like Qualcomm, where he worked on stuff like TDMA and a lot of the hardware that went into phones in the early days. So that was very much his DNA. It was thinking about how do you build really efficient, at scale networking systems and the sort of hardware and software related to those things. And so when Ethereum started getting popular, he took a look and he was like, "This is pretty cool. An open compute system seems really powerful." There seems to be some fundamental issues here, notably one, which is that EVM is a strictly sequential computing paradigm. And so what that means is that there are some performance trade-offs that you make because of that. And so that is when he saw that, he's like, okay, can we build this in a way that leans into some of the strengths that have made compute generally what it is today? And I think the two that are worth calling out are, one, parallelization, and then two, the fact that hardware consistently gets better over time. So on parallelization, I think anyone who's been following the way that compute has developed over the last few years, in particular as compute for GPUs and gaming use cases, as well as now increasingly sort of AI and machine learning related use cases, all that stuff is done on the progress there has entirely been made through better and better parallelization of processing. And that's how we can do these ridiculously large scale models like what ChatGPT or OpenAI is doing with ChatGPT. So, I mean, he had the observation that parallelization is the way you scale. And so how can we incorporate that into a blockchain system? And then there's a second, which is hardware has basically since the 60s, since the chip industry really got going, consistently followed Moore's law and gotten more and more performant and scalable. So how can you build a blockchain that leverages that as well, right? That gets faster for free. And so I think those are some of the insights that then led him to design Solana the way it's designed. And part of that, to your point on or question on proof of stake versus proof of work, is that proof of work is just a very inefficient system. And so, when we think about how do you secure this network, we want to do it in a way that's not so inefficient. And so proof of stake was something that there was already some literature around and made sense as like a good economic way to protect the network that wasn't highly wasteful. And so those were some of the insights I think that led to him designing Solana the way it was designed. Yeah.
And that kind of leads to the next question, which is, what is it about Solana then that makes it interesting for developers, or at least in theory makes it interesting for developers, all developers, but of course specifically for game developers too. What makes Solana, what is the differentiating factor for Solana as it relates to developers using the tools and technologies that you guys are building?
Yeah, sure. So we can talk about, I guess, from the lens of game developers in particular. And so the way I think about it is that Solana is important for, call it, two buckets. There's one which is expanding the design space for your game. So if you're building a Web3, so this is very much from like the game developer's perspective, like what are they able to do? So if you're a game developer who's building a Web3 game, I think what Solana is powerful for is getting rid of the limitations that you might have, right? So in particular, right, the things that are important here are you need a blockchain that's very scalable, right? I think everyone's aspiring for success here. So your game backend, right, functionally, which is what blockchain is in some ways, needs to be able to handle the success case when you have millions, tens of millions of players using the thing. And in that success case, it needs to be really, really cheap to use. And so that's where the low cost comes in. And then the final thing is the way that Solana is designed, where on-chain programs are things that other people can use, basically lets game developers leverage infrastructure that already exists very easily. You don't have to constantly build your own smart contracts for stuff. And so all of that, in my mind, is under the bucket of like game developer. Like the thing that's powerful about Solana is that it removes the constraints that you otherwise have to work around on slower, less performant, more expensive blockchains. So that's to me like if I'm trying to build a game, like what Solana lets me do. From a gamer's perspective, I think the powerful thing is basically there's probably two things. It's the speed to finality and then the cost again. So on the speed to finality, right, gamers like, I'm buying new monitors every year so I can get the refresh rate to get, marginally lower so that, I get like that better performance on the game. So gamers care about their ping, or at least hardcore games. So hardcore gamers care about their ping, and even the average, right, like casual gamer on your mobile phone cares about the user experience, that it's crisp, that it's fast. When I hit a button, like I get a response. Like, it's really important. So those things are important, and I think Solana basically delivers that in spades. You mentioned the sort of speed to finality of being less than 400 milliseconds, and something we constantly work on to get lower. Solana's the fastest out there, and I think that matters for gamers in particular. And then the low cost thing, right? Like if I'm engaging with the game's economy, maybe I'm swapping tokens or purchasing an NFT or staking something, whatever, I don't want to have to think about the incremental cost of that happening. Like I should just do it, right? And so that's why having fees basically be free is important, and why our whole model is, or like mentality is, how can we get fees to be lower and lower? Right? They're already extremely low, right? Like 0.0025, as you mentioned, or I missed a zero there. But the goal is to like constantly work in to get that lower. And so the gamer never has this friction and experience. And so anyways, that's how I think about it. It's like, give game developers the ability to be really awesome games. And on the other hand, once those games are there, make the experience really frictionless for the gamers themselves.
Got it. And I think I can't remember exactly when he said it, and I couldn't actually dig up where the quote was. I think it may have been a tweet or something like that, which is why I couldn't find it. But I think Anatoly is on the record as saying something along the lines of gaming is one of the big use cases that drives the flywheel of mass market adoption, which is a sentiment that has guided my career in gaming since the very beginning once I got into it. So I passionately believe that to be true. I'm curious to hear how much gaming fed into the original use cases that Anatoly and you guys were thinking about internally versus something like DeFi or other use cases that Solana is also obviously used for. If you had to kind of rank the verticals that Solana plays in, or is influential in, how would that look like internally? What kind of conversations do you guys have around like, oh, we must support gaming as a first-class citizen versus DeFi or versus something else?
Yeah, for sure. So historically, right, I think when Anatoly was conceiving of Solana, he had maybe a slightly financial view, but in his mind, like blockchain is a very good tool for building open systems, and one of the open systems that can be very useful are like our financial things. But I don't think he had a strong view on like which types of economies or what type of commerce could be facilitated by blockchain. He just thought that commerce, like in general, a blockchain would be very good for facilitating commerce. And so it's really easy then for you to make the leap from like, okay, what type of commerce is very natively digital? And games are like the ultimate form, if you will, and largest form of natively digital commerce. So from the early days, gaming was something that we were interested in. If you look at like sort of Solana's history, DeFi is probably the first thing that really like caught fire, but gaming sort of followed very closely after that. And to your question on like how do we rank it internally, it's difficult to rank. Well, one interesting data point might be if you look at within the Solana Foundation, sort of which is the organization I'm a part of, the largest sub team, if you will, is focused on games. So if that's any indication of how much games matter to us, hopefully that tells you something. So games hugely important because again, it's the natively digital thing, and so it's like a big bet. And we're all gamers too, so there's some bias there in terms of like we personally care about it, we personally play these things. Now, I guess it's worth calling out, right? Like we think other things are important too, but games are definitely in that like first class citizen status in terms of things we care about.
Yeah, I actually remember just anecdote here when we were making our choice around which chain to build on. This is for Blockstars back in I think spring, maybe early summer of 2021. I actually remember looking at we collectively as a team looking at Solana and actually dismissing Solana initially because it looked like you had this infographic out that was like, here are all the different logos of the companies that are on there. And it was mostly DeFi, right? And I don't think there was gaming at all on there. And so we were like, well, it's not really for gaming. And then I remember literally like maybe 3 months later, same infographic, lots more logos on it. And suddenly there was gaming as like this big category with all the different games that we're building on Solana. And so that's ultimately why we ended up making the choice at that time. It was like, okay, we can see how, there is this support for gaming. I'm curious, how did that happen in that time period, right? Like you said, DeFi, it was first DeFi, and then gaming came very quickly afterwards. Was it Web3 developers, gaming companies, startups coming to you and saying, hey, we'd like to build on Solana, we think it's a good idea? Or was it the other way around where you guys were going out to devs and saying, hey, we'd like to support gaming as a use case. We think Solana is a great fit. Come and build with us. How did that happen internally, organically, inorganically at that time?
Yeah, it's a good question. So my claim to fame, if you will, or my very minor claim to fame, I was actually the first person at the foundation focused on games. So I joined, I guess, 2 years ago, a little more maybe. And I didn't join necessarily to focus on games. I sort of was to be a generalist, help grow the ecosystem, but no one at the time was focused on games. And sort of I raised my hand and was like, hey, this feels like really important. And since then, of course, like we've expanded the games team very significantly. It's like a huge focus area for us. But anyway, random aside. So from a strategic perspective, it's a little bit of a mix. So we were blessed to have a few games, basically a few game developers who wanted to build Web3 games in the very early days, look at Solana and realize like, hey, this is actually a really, the characteristics of the chain actually enable us to build our vision. And so a few of the games that come to mind are probably Star Atlas and Aurori that decided to build on Solana in like the very early days. And we are obviously a big fan of the team. We've been working with them. And so I think there's part of it, which is call it luck, organic growth, right place, right time. So we had a few of these games sort of in the early days. And then in combination with that, like we were increasingly staffing up our team to go focus on games. In terms of how we went about it, I think fundamentally, I don't think we can convince people to build blockchain games. I think that's like a journey that you have to go on yourself. Like as a game developer, it's like you have to decide that this is something that you care about and want to do. And once you reach that decision, like then we're here to help like make you successful. So that's I guess the fine distinction I draw, which is that what we were trying to do is empower game developers who wanted to build a Web3 game. We weren't really going out there trying to convince people to build Web3 games, because I think what we've seen is that success in the space correlates extremely highly with your passion and grit, and we can't infuse that in people. So, but what we can do is like be facilitators and help accelerate. So what we were doing is basically going out there, talking to as many of the lean-in builders as we can, right? Like you guys included. So that's kind of the way we went about it. And sort of in parallel to talking to game studios is also like trying to understand as quickly as possible what are the pain points that game builders are running into, and then how can we build infrastructure to ease those pains, right? Whether that's launching NFTs, or hey, we need to set up a pool to swap tokens, or we need a Unity SDK, like that kind of stuff. So there's a bunch of prongs to the strategy, but hopefully that, I think if I had to sequence it, it's like we were fortunate in the early days to have some people believe in us, and then we basically took that and ran with it and found other lead builders.
And that's a perfect segue actually into my next question, which is you don't just support Web3 builders through the technology piece and kind of having the conversations. You've actually taken a pretty active approach in terms of directly investing in certain companies. I think you last year, this is some months ago now, but you launched a $100 million gaming fund that was specifically for South Korea. Interested to hear. I haven't read much about that since you made the announcement. Very curious to hear what's going on with that. Why did you make that decision? Obviously, the Solana Foundation or other parts of Solana, I think you guys do reorgs on a fairly regular basis. Restructure some of the corporate entities, but obviously you guys make direct minority equity investments in game developers, including Blockstars. Full disclosure there. Curious to hear what else you guys are doing, kind of more directly along these lines, where you're actually taking minority stakes in companies. You're actually setting aside significant funds. $100 million is not to be sniffed at, and actually, making these direct investments for presumably strategic reasons. So, tell me a little bit more about what's going on there. What is your thesis around that? What are the criteria that you look at in terms of how you make these investments, who you make these investments into? What is the rationale behind doing some of these more direct, hands-on investment activities?
Yeah, it's a good question, and actually, so there's. To your comment on the reorg, the one thing that it's worth probably starting the conversation with is just framing some of the organizations here. So there is the Solana Foundation, which is a nonprofit entity based out of Geneva, Switzerland. Its mission is sort of broadly to empower the ecosystem and like be a steward for it, if you will. And that's the team I'm a part of. And most of the games team sits in the foundation. Then there is separately Solana Ventures. Solana Ventures is a venture firm that is trying to earn venture scale returns, primarily by investing in projects built on Solana. And so, for example, the Ventures is the entity that does the bulk of the investing. So, for example, like that $100 million fund is sort of a Ventures effort. I don't want to speak for them, but the way I think about Ventures, and I think sort of their thesis is that they want to make bets on things in crypto that have the potential and are really looking for an at-scale outcome. And so if you think about things that are trying to do things on chain at scale, like they need a chain that can do that. And so they have this view that like, okay, if we're trying to make at-scale bets, like realistically, they have to be Solana native, or practically speaking. And so that's where they focus. It's like, what are things that Solana sort of uniquely positioned to empower at scale? And so they invest in games that they think fit that thesis, but also other stuff, whether it's DeFi or social or whatever. So that's Ventures. The foundation is something that's like, investing is not our mandate, it's not our goal. it's something we can do and we have been, right? So in the case of Blockstars, and the way we think about it is like maybe a little bit different. We think about who is pushing the boundaries of what's being done on Solana, right? And so, for example, with Blockstars, like a lot of the things that we were excited about and thought were really interesting is that it's trying to push forward how people think about the way that they experience a game, where it's like, this is, a band that I'm cultivating. And so I think that this is sort of, there's some questions around, why should games build on blockchain? I think many games don't have a good answer to this question. I think you guys have a pretty exceptionally good one. And so that's what was exciting to us. And we thought that like this could inspire other people to think about how they build games in a different way. So Foundation, generally speaking, not an investor. We do it in sort of some exceptional cases where we think people are like pushing the boundary in some way. Most of actually what the foundation does when it comes to deploying capital is in the form of grants for public goods. So public goods are things that people are building, so that are freely available resources for everyone. So if you're building, an Unreal 5 SDK, right? That might be. I mean, we have at least one of those on Solana now. I think we have a couple, but if you're doing that, it's like really high quality integration that game developers find useful. Hey, that's something that we'd support because it's like a public good. So ventures, sort of a VC investor doing VC investor type stuff with a focus on sort of things that are uniquely enabled by Solana. Foundation, mostly about public goods because we're a steward of the ecosystem. Occasionally, making investments in people that we think are like pushing the boundary in some way.
This public good piece is actually, it's kind of a big deal. I didn't know about this until we just now you told me about it. How can people kind of keep up to date with that? Because I think that's one of the biggest pain points for game devs right now is the friction, the sheer friction of integrating with blockchain and then wallets, and then you can't use your chosen game engine. You just mentioned Unity SDK and Unreal 5 SDK. Those are big deals for game devs, right? Because game devs typically don't want to have to be building their own game engine from scratch. Like that's just not, that's a solved problem, right?
That is a bad idea. Yeah.
Yeah, many times over. And so that again is the kind of thing that I think can bring Web3 developers to embracing blockchain technologies and kind of expanding the design choices that you can make in games by integrating, digital ownership and or tokenized economies. Tell me more about this public good piece and the kind of efforts you're supporting right now, especially as it relates to game devs. You mentioned two that are extremely exciting to me, Unity SDK and Unreal 5. What else are you guys doing? Or again, it's not you doing it. You're seeing these public good type things happening and supporting that. What else is coming down the pipe in terms of making life easier for game devs to integrate blockchain technologies, specifically Solana?
Yeah, sure. So there's actually, and we can include this link in the show notes perhaps, there's a Notion page that we put together that's like a directory of resources specifically for game devs. We call it the Solana Games Kit. And so that's where we try to keep an updated list of resources, mostly free resources that game devs who are building games on Solana can leverage, including links to like the Unity SDK, Unreal 5 SDK. But in terms of other things that we see coming down the pipe, I think there's a few problem areas we're thinking a lot about now. You mentioned a couple of them. So one is wallet experience, right? How do we make that experience as seamless as possible on web, on mobile, in sort of applications that are downloaded? And people who are building interesting tooling that facilitates that experience, something we're very interested in. So actually, for those who are listening to this podcast, if you have ideas in these problem areas, definitely go to the Solana Foundation website and let us know. Because this is, I think, really important stuff. So wallet experience, one big bucket. There's a second, which is fiat on and off ramping. This is just something that there's a bunch of people out there who do it, but I think we can get better at nailing the use case, especially for games. So continues to be an area that I want to sort of see experimentation in. So those are two buckets. There are a few others I think that are interesting. One is around people who are building social and community management tooling for games. So relative, one of the interesting and powerful things about doing stuff on chain is that this is an open source of data that you can leverage. And so, it's an interesting way to do user acquisition. You can look at on-chain users, you can categorize their behavior, And that can inform some targeting strategy of like who are on-chain users that we actually want to bring to our game. Based on maybe other game assets that they own, you can see, hey, this person's played other shooters, might make sense for my game. So there's a piece on user acquisition. There's also a piece around managing the existing community that you have, right? Understanding, hey, what are the people that already own my, say NFTs? What are they doing? What do they care about? How are they behaving? And then how can I sort of cater the experience to them? So I think that's sort of an interesting area as well. I think that's a little bit earlier in the sense that these tools become more important the more on-chain users you have. If it's a small set of users, then it's like not as high leverage to build this stuff. But if you think about the future, I think it's a big one. So I guess those are a few. I think there's another big problem area that we're thinking about, which is distribution. How, especially a Web3 game, can you get to both the crypto audience and that community, as well as sort of the world and gamers in general, right? Because I think most game builders aspire towards reaching gamers as a community, and that's certainly what I'm excited about. So how do you do that given that there are some constraints with Steam, AGS, being on the mobile app stores, right? So we've already taken some bets in this direction in the sense that like the Solana, the Saga phone having its own dApp store, but continuing to think about how do we support games getting distribution.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just hit all, like any Web3 game dev who's been working in the space, like will tell you those are the big pain points. It's the friction piece with the wallet. It's the lack of distribution channels and easy UA. It's the fiat on and off ramp piece. I think an area that's interesting to call out as well, which you didn't mention, is how do you integrate blockchain technologies in your game without actually having it force people into a blockchain experience? That free-to-play freemium model that's so familiar to gamers from mobile in particular, where you just download an app completely frictionless. You start playing, and then if you like the game, you can convert it into a payer with just the click of a button, without having to do like the wallet piece and the like crypto piece and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's that's another big pain point I think that us game devs are experiencing. So if anybody's building that for Solana, get in touch with Kuleen.
Yes, please do.
There might be some grants in it for you. Cool. Well, you mentioned something that I wanted to talk about next anyway, and that is the Saga phone. And this kind of ties in nicely with the idea of, go where the gamers are. Mobile gaming obviously is huge, and is by far the biggest revenue driver for all of mobile in general. And so very ambitious from Solana to go making your own phone. The Saga phone, I believe, it's a Web3 native experience. Obviously, I'm sure you guys are not blind to the fact that the road to mobile success, especially on the hardware side, is littered with giant companies who've tried and failed. Amazon Fire Phone and Facebook Phone, and there's a whole bunch along the way. So very, very curious to hear that this ambition is not curious. I get it. I understand the desire to have a native mobile experience. Very curious to hear more about your thinking behind it, the dApp store that you mentioned briefly there, and what, if anything, it means for games in particular. And by the way, I think I've ordered 3 Saga phones and I haven't received them yet. So if you're listening...
Yeah, so dev kits are starting to get out. Actually, I can follow up after the podcast on that. Dev kits have started getting in the hands of people.
Awesome.
In fact, I saw a Twitter post earlier today of someone saying, like, this is my first tweet for my Saga phone. So
I'm excited.
Yeah, it's happening. So let's do it. So I guess first, you're right. Like you mentioned this a little bit, but I'll go over it again. Like the motivation here was that most of the world experiences the internet through their phone.
Yeah.
And a ton of what they're doing on their phone is playing games. So it's not really an acceptable state of affairs that the mobile experience of crypto is like the second-class citizen. So that was the motivating factor. And actually where we started was building software for Android to make signing transactions better, wallet connections better. And then I think Anatoly realized, he's like, well, actually, like I know a fair bit about the hardware of phones. Like I think actually that we could probably build our own phone. Right? And it's not like we're designing a bunch of custom hardware for the most part. A lot of this is just that he knew the right people, like the team at Awesome, who have the ability to manufacture phones. And so we thought, hey, we can also not only can we build the software, we can actually package it into hardware with a wallet and really showcase this, right? So to your point on the mobile world being littered with people who tried and failed, we're extremely cognizant of that. I think, personally, the probability that the Saga becomes this phone that, hundreds of millions of people have is extremely low. But that's not really the point. The point is that we want to showcase what is possible, right? And what is possible when you have a device that has both transaction signing be really seamless, so the UX is really crisp, and has distribution, right? So the App Store, the decentralized App Store, or the dApp Store really, doesn't charge 30%, supports crypto applications that have token NFTs. If we can show what's possible with a really powerful experience on mobile, we hope to galvanize the crypto community to build for that more directly. And the important thing here is that there's the Saga, there's the actual phone, which is a pretty high-end device, pretty awesome. But there's also the Solana mobile stack, which is a software toolkit that works on Android, so you can build Android applications using it. And so I think if what we were able to accomplish is just to get a bunch of applications to use this Solana mobile stack on regular Android devices and have those be really high-quality experiences, especially games, that would be incredible, or at least personally. I don't know if I totally agree with that, but that to me, big success outcome. If we also sell a bunch of phones, hell yeah. So that's the thinking, if you will, behind the Saga and where we want to push the mobile experience.
And what are you doing specifically for games, if anything? Are there any?
Yes. So for games, in terms of the software, the hardware, there's nothing game specific. That said, we're talking to a bunch of games now, or the Saga team's talking to a bunch of games now, and we're trying to facilitate connections to people who are interested in being sort of, in the dApp Store at launch. So there's an element here of are there games that are really interested in distribution, that already have mobile builds or using the SMS stack, and there are a bunch of those who are. So there's a distribution angle here for games, and then we're basically mostly working with games teams who already have a mobile build on the roadmap, and flagging to them that, hey, SMS exists. You can actually basically build a better version, or at least a more crypto-friendly version of your Android build.
And just to clarify, SMS, you mean Solana mobile stack, not
correct? Yeah, sorry.
Short messaging service.
That is, yes, yeah. I'm glad you clarified that. I don't mean the messaging service. I mean Solana mobile stack.
Cool. And what's the timeline in terms of getting that to market into that? I know you said you're already kind of working with some developers, but what's the roadmap look like for really pushing this out there? I know that shipping early 2023. We're in early 2023 now, into the hands of developers, and then from there on out, what comes next?
It's a good question. Actually, I don't have a good answer to this, which I ought to. But so basically, developer kits are getting in the hands of people starting right now, or it's already in the hands of folks. I think we'll want to get the feedback from that, iterate, and then at some point in 2023, then it'll go out. But I actually don't know. Is it mid 2023? Q3, Q4, but sometime this year. Stay tuned.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, that was a very unsatisfying answer, but I actually just don't know, which is a little sad.
No, that's fair enough. So in addition to the Saga phone, you guys obviously do a lot of other initiatives as well. Those of us who were in Lisbon, which I think you sadly missed, Kuleen, we missed you there, for Solana Breakpoint late last year. I think it was the second annual. I didn't go to the first one, but was there for the second one late last year. A whole slew of other things were announced, many which are obviously not gaming related at all. You've got weird and wonderful things like geo NFTs, and you've got Solana Spaces, which is the Solana branded store, and a whole bunch of other stuff that was just very ambitious, right? Exciting to see, exciting to hear, and of course, it was a packed out conference, which was great to see. A lot of excitement there. And one of the things you guys did in Lisbon was you had a whole gaming track. In fact, a whole gaming venue, a venue dedicated just to gaming, and all the panels and all the demos there were, specifically related to gaming. And it was really exciting for me to kind of get hands-on with so many games in the same place, try out a bunch of different, integrations with Solana, blockchain, NFTs, tokenized economies. A lot of inspiration there. But here's what I will say. I think if we're intellectually honest, there's a long way to go for Web3 native games, blockchain-enabled games, to get to the point where they're as frictionless and as smooth and as polished, and as, if you're going for AAA quality, then, AAA quality level games on Web3 are few and far between. I think we have a long way to go. So I'm very curious, and I think that's fine, by the way. I don't personally have a problem with that. I think it's great that there are so many developers experimenting with different things and like different business models, different design paradigms for what games can be when they integrate blockchain technologies. That's totally fine. But I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on, what is Solana doing to kind of help level up? I think you've mentioned a few of these things already, but what are you guys doing to help level up that whole ecosystem? The rising tide lifting all boats kind of notion, where one of the things I love about Web3 is how collaborative we are. In Web2 mobile gaming, like, you would never share your internal metrics. You would never, do shared Twitter spaces. Like, you would hide everything behind walled gardens, until you're ready to show it to the world, and then, ship it so that nobody else can copy you, right? Whereas in Web3, there's a lot more of that, like, willing copying. We're happily sharing with other projects and other games what we're doing. And I see that from, you guys as well, Solana, Magic Eden, a lot of the other ecosystem players that are trying to help that rising tide lift all boats. And I'm just very curious to hear, like, that was a big thought that came home with me from Lisbon, was how can we collectively improve the quality bar and remove some of this friction? Some of it's on the developers themselves, the game developers, but some of it's not really in our control. Some of it's at the ecosystem level, it's at the tech stack level, it's at the wallet level, and a lot of these things have to kind of work with each other, right? Some marketplaces working with the tech, working with the game devs, working with the wallet providers, working with the fiat payment providers. There's just a lot of moving parts, and I wonder. That was my big overarching question coming home from Lisbon. I wonder, how can we, as a Web3 community, and you specifically, Solana, the blockchain, help push that forward, help move us in the right direction to get to that friction? Because games are meant to be fun, right? Games are meant to be fun, and you're not really there to, like, do a bunch of hoops. You just want to pick up your game, start playing, have a good time, not worry about transaction times, not worry about fees, not worry about wallets and things like that. You've alluded to some of the stuff you guys are doing. I'm just really curious to hear, with that hat of intellectual honesty on. There's a lot of work, I think, still to be done to really level up the Web3 gaming experiences.
No, I 100% agree. The way I think about it actually is that Web3 games are a concept that a lot of us are very excited about, I think for good reasons, which is that games are the best example of really rich digital economies and, like, digital experiences that people care about. And so it feels like there's something there, that Web3, which is also very good at facilitating large digital economies and, conveying a real sense of ownership digitally, like, conceptually, there's a very powerful fit. However, to your point on intellectual honesty, I still categorize games in Web3 as pre-product market fit. Like, we still haven't seen a game that, in my mind, like, there's like three things that we want to see. It's like, one is the game is a large scale success, like a bunch of people play it because they love the game. Two, that it has a sustainable economy, right? Like, an open economy that's working, that isn't just a bunch of people speculating. And then three is, like, has compelling, like, there's a compelling reason why parts of the game are on chain. And so I'd argue there's no game in crypto that has all three today. And when I see all three, like, in my mind, then we'll have proven the game's a product market. But until then, like, we're in experimentation phase. So 100% agree. So anyway, in terms of what we are doing, I guess if I think about it, there's maybe a few buckets. The first big bucket is laying the groundwork for the technology and the supporting infrastructure so that game developers' lives and gamers' lives are as easy as possible. So there's a few layers to this piece. The first is the protocol itself, constantly working to make the protocol faster, cheaper, real scalable at the sort of core level, right? So that is just constant ongoing work effort, and totally sort of this is what he thinks about first and foremost. Making the blockchain awesome. Then the second layer is, okay, if the blockchain's awesome, you still need to have high quality supporting infrastructure, whether that's the wallets, the NFT marketplaces, the on-ramps, the RPC providers who are providing indexing services so the game studios can understand, hey, which wallets actually own my game assets, et cetera. Analytics service, there's a bunch of other secondary services that you need. And so getting those built. And so I think our role in that is in some ways seeding perhaps some of the early teams. A lot of it's also a coordination role. We're a steward of the ecosystem. We're trying to coordinate Magic Eden and Phantom and various other folks to get to a place where the cohesive experience is really compelling for game studios. So the part of here, which is us being a little bit of a shepherd. One of the things that actually we constantly ask ourselves though is we don't want to be kingmakers, and we also don't we recognize that our perspective on things may not necessarily be the best. So the balance that we try to find is, yes, we want to be shepherds, but also we want to get out of the way of people who can move much faster and get to a great outcome if we're not involved. And so we're constantly trying to make sure, do we actually need to be involved here, or are people just better off innovating on their own? So we want to be helpful, but we also try to let people succeed and not get in their way. So anyway, in my mind, that's that first bucket of tech and supporting infrastructure, making that's really high quality. I think there's a second way in which the foundation can support this, which is helping get more users on chain so that the ocean or the pie, if you will, gets larger and larger for games, right? Because getting a wallet set up is a big barrier. Self-custody is a responsibility, and it's a responsibility a lot of people don't understand and aren't comfortable with. And that's totally understandable. And so in some ways, what we want to do is create more high-value use cases in Web3 so that people have a compelling reason to actually educate themselves and go through self-custody. Because I actually think that there's only so much that we can improve the user experience. At some point, there's a fundamental thing that people will have to understand if they want to have self-custody, that hey, this is a responsibility that I'm taking. And there's no amount of product design that can ultimately change that. There's some limit. So I think the only real solution is that there need to be use cases in Web3 that are so compelling that people actually are willing to educate themselves on Web3. And so what we want to do is cultivate as many of those as possible, games, but tons of stuff outside games, because once you have someone who's comfortable with self-custody and has assets in a wallet, all of a sudden the incremental effort for them to try other Web3 applications becomes much lower. So if we're able to onboard a ton of people through DeFi or through some sort of decentralized social play, those are all people I think that are much more likely to engage in a Web3 game, right? So we're trying to broaden that pie in general. Now, it's quite possible that games are actually the best way to do this, but in general, sort of that's one way to think about it. And then the last thing here, which is not really in our control, but maybe is me it's a call for help, if you will. The thing that I want to see from game builders, I guess, is experimentation. Because until we find real product market fit, I think we just need to rapidly try a bunch of compelling ideas and see what works and what doesn't. I'm sort of skeptical about building quote unquote AAA games for Web3 right now when you don't really understand what's the type of game that makes sense. And so someone used the term III, high quality, AAA, high quality indie game. I want to see a bunch of AAA stuff, I guess. That's experimenting with what's happening on chain, or at least like what's the Web3 component game, right? And then once we figure out what works, then we can invest hundreds of millions of dollars to make this like a really high production value game. Anyways, that again, not in our control. That's just like, I guess what I would want to do is encourage that experimentation as much as possible and reduce the barrier to do so.
Yeah, the middle layer, I want to come back to that, which is kind of the classic chicken and egg question, right? Like if you were to boil that down, and it kind of goes a little bit against where we started with, the Anatoly quote, and what I kind of happen to believe typically is, you have these new technologies, and a great way to accelerate mass market adoption is to provide games and, a fun reason to do something. But I think what I heard you say, maybe not definitively, but at least allude to a little bit, is maybe this isn't actually one of those types of technologies, because it's actually more important, because the value is so financial at the moment, and maybe that won't be true forever, but DeFi being the primary use cases, when the value is financial of adopting a technology, you will jump through a lot of hoops. If you think you're going to make money, or you're going to make some aspect of your financial life easier, faster, better, whatever, you are prepared to jump through hoops. But you're not really prepared to jump through hoops for a game. You kind of, we talked about the friction piece. So maybe it's kind of, maybe it is that chicken and egg piece here where, you, Solana, I mean, it's not your responsibility per se. Obviously, it's in your self-interest to onboard as many people onto Solana as possible for whatever use cases makes sense. But it is more of a case of, it's great that we're going to have fun games eventually on chain, but the reason people will come on chain is actually not for the games; it's for the financial aspect. Is that a fair
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you asked that question. That's not exactly what I mean. So I think I was saying like there need to be use cases with real value for people to come on chain. And when I say value, I don't mean financial value actually. Financial value is the one I'm least excited about. It's more like fulfillment value. Like, so as an example, like PFP NFTs are an interesting thing where PFP NFTs in many ways people look down upon, especially, for example, game developers. And I can sort of understand the perspective, which is that, it's just a JPEG. It's like a JPEG, and you like barely even own the JPEG in many instances. You're mostly like owning the NFT, like owning a receipt to the JPEG. And it's like, it's so much easier to do these than creating a game, which is all true. But actually, the funny thing is, I would say that NFT PFPs have product market fit. Like, because I've met plenty of people, and myself included, that have bought an NFT PFP because we just like the art, like it resonated with me. I identified with it. Something I just wanted to be, like I was like, hey, this is cool, and I bought it, right? And so that, like, I didn't expect to make money on the NFT. It was just like, this is cool. I sort of vibe with this project. Like, I bought the thing. Now, granted, many people buy NFTs for just speculative reasons. That to me is not really product market fit. But at this point, plenty of people have bought NFTs like unironically because it just connected with them, right? So that to me, that's an example of value where it's like this intangible thing where it's like I felt fulfilled. Like I was like sort of slightly happier that I owned this thing and was part of this community and I got to put it on Twitter or whatever. It's very intangible and it maybe sounds a little bit hokey, but to me, like PFPs are actually one of the few things in crypto that has product market fit. And yes, it's kind of janky and maybe niche, and we'll see if they scale, but that to me, like there are people who have set up wallets. I know this because I've helped them do so because they're like, hey, this is cool. Like I just want one. Right. So what my point was, we need more things like that, more experiences like that in crypto, where they look at the experiences and are like, hey, that's cool. I really want to engage in that. And then they will, and to, like the reward of engaging in that experience is worth them setting up the wallet and going through self-custody. And games are probably have the highest likelihood of being that engaging experience. But my point was like, any engaging experience has the potential to compel someone to come on chain. And then once they're on chain, the likelihood that they'll do other stuff is much higher.
Yeah. Okay. So I totally buy that. Absolutely. And I think, the number of things that so I initially got into crypto for the financial aspect back in the last bull run, back in 2016, and then lived through the crypto winter until now, and rode another wave here. But I had already engaged with crypto at that point. I kind of like the hurdle was much lower, and I hadn't done anything for years, right? Because the last crypto winter was pretty long, several years long. I didn't do anything for years. But then when the next bull picked up, I was like, oh, I'm ready to engage with more use cases in crypto. And I think that's, to me at least, what I don't know how long this current crypto winter. I actually have a question for you on this to kind of wrap the pod up here for today. But I don't know how long this crypto winter is going to last. But what has happened is a lot of people got onboarded for the financial reasons and other value reasons. To your point, the NFTs, vibing with the community, all good reasons, perfectly valid reasons why somebody would engage with crypto. They've probably gone dormant for a while because of this crypto winter. But then when the next, I don't want to call it a bull, but when the next kind of wave of adoption, let's put it that way, happens, people are going to be much more like folks like me from the last crypto winter, ready to re-engage with the ecosystem, ready to re-engage with more dApps, ready to, play games, their wallets, they can dust them off, their digital wallets, get the cobwebs off, and off they go, starting to engage. So I do think, while we may be in for a bit of a lull, and this is my question to you next, is what do you see happening in 2023 and beyond? We may be in a bit of a lull right now, and adoption might kind of be flat or even stall out completely. But a lot of people got onboarded onto crypto. There's a lot of awareness of crypto, way more than in 2016, 17, when the last bear market hit. So my question to you really is, what do you see happening in 2023? Not just for gaming, but yes, with a gaming lens, please. I think there's still more bad news, so to speak, to come. I don't think the news cycle is fully played out yet. So my view is it shouldn't really impact Web3 gaming, but it does, because it impacts that broader adoption piece, which we just talked about. And so it's just that much harder to then onboard Web3 gamers for Web3 because you've got those hurdles and that friction. So what are your predictions for 2023 and beyond, especially as it relates to gaming, but just more broadly? Obviously, you guys have a much better perch from which to kind of observe the overall market. And so curious to hear your predictions.
Yeah. So there's one thing, there's one rule I have in crypto, which is you never say never. Literally anything can happen. And I've also learned that my ability to predict the future is extremely poor. So I don't have any amazing predictions to give, but I can speak to how I see, frame how, where we are right now, and I think what needs to happen. So that I have a little bit higher conviction. So what happened in 2021 and early 2022, where I was insane bull run, it did get crypto in the limelight and got a ton of attention on it, right? A lot of normal people, if you will, heard about NFTs, maybe purchased one, whatever, or just bought some tokens on Coinbase or whatever. So that did happen. Prices got way out of line with the actual reality of what people were doing on chain. And so in my mind, actually, so this is in the broader economy, I think there's some craziness going on. And so the interest rate change then precipitated a basically reality set back in the economy very generally. And that sort of had that took place in crypto too, but because of the nature of crypto, where the up cycles are crazy and the down cycles are equally crazy, you have violent downswing. So it's basically back to reality for everyone, especially in crypto. And I think now the way I see it is that the crypto world needs to prove that it's valuable to people, right? Because a bunch of people heard about crypto in the last 2 years and maybe tried it out in some way, shape, or form. And then, in the last 6 months, I think the crypto industry has done an excellent job of just destroying the trust that the average person has in the industry, right? So the industry needs to rebuild trust broadly. So we have a steep hill to climb. And I think the only way we do that is we deliver experiences that people that actually bring some level of fulfillment, meaning, or value to their lives. I think games have one of the best shots at doing this in terms of delivering experiences that people are like, hey, this was great. And, like it was a reason, like I'm happy that I played this game and had this did these things on chain in the context of this game. Because the thing I worry about to me is like that crypto ends up like VR. It's like this technology that has been hyped up for a long, long time, but remains subscale and sort of niche. And I think the battle that we have to fight now is to not end up like VR, right? Like actually deliver great experiences and value to people at large scale. So I think that's the battle that we need to fight, and I think that's the only way we really regain trust. And that could take years. For games in particular, what I expect to happen is that this year, so 2023, we'll see a bunch of real games launch. Games built by people like yourself, like real game builders who've built successful games before. And it'll be really interesting to see if any of these hit. Right? Games, super hit driven, brutally difficult to get a hit game. So I have no idea if we'll see a success this year, and I have even less of an idea of which games those might be. But I think we'll get a bunch of good shots on goal this year, and I'm optimistic that we'll see at least a few. Right, like to our earlier point, or my other point on like games trying to prove that product market fit. Dream scenario, we get a couple games this year that have product market fit, like that demonstrate how you can build a Web3 game that has a sustainable economy, has a bunch of players, and does some cool stuff on chain. So yeah, not much of a prediction, but more like how I see this year as being like the first test, if you will, for Web3 games. And the good case would be we get some good games that have product market fit, and then they help the battle of regaining society's trust in crypto.
It's a tall order, but it can be done.
We have a lot of work to do for sure.
We have some work to do collectively. Well, I think that's a great thought to end on. I think it's optimistic while realistic at the same time. That's good. We should all as an industry be optimistic, of course, of what we're building, but realistic at the same time about where we are right now in this moment in time. So, Kuleen, thank you so much for coming on the pod today. Great insights, not just about Solana, but the industry and the ecosystem and gaming more generally. So feel free to come back to the show anytime. Loved having you on and enjoyed our chat.
Thanks, Niko. Yeah, always enjoy our conversations. This was a ton of fun.
And also a big thank you to all of our listeners. We will be back in a couple of weeks with more interviews, more insights, and more analysis from the weird and wonderful world of Web3. So until next time, friends, stay crypto curious and feel free to send questions, guest recommendations, and comments to me. My email is nico@naavik.co, and you can find me on Twitter @NicoTheFin. DM's always open. And we will have a bunch of show notes for some of the links that we talked about today so that folks who are curious about the Solana Foundation, some of the tools that they're building, can easily access those. Thank you very much.